the he and the... Yeah.
Right.
Constantly, it says there, it contrasts he, this, it's always a him, a he, who's going to come and die for the sins. It says, for instance, for he was cut off,
Right.
out of the land of the living, for the transgression of my people. And of course, as you'll all remember, my people, let my people go, was what Moses said to Pharaoh. And God's people in the Old Testament is Israel. So obviously, for he was cut off for the transgression of my people. There's a contrast there.
Right.
And God is always making that contrast between he and we, or us, or my people. And it's very clear. But for this scholar, Dr. Lapid, this Orthodox Jewish scholar, and I come from a Jewish background as well, for him to accept Jesus as the only way, the Messiah, would be very difficult, as you all know. Most Jews remain Jewish, most Catholics remain Catholic, most Hindus remain Hindu, most Buddhists remain Buddhist, most Muslims remain Muslim. People don't, according to Jesus, really want truth to step aside and really see what's really there, rather than to incur the distaste and displeasure of their family and friends by saying, hey, if you're a Hindu or a Muslim, I'm checking out Jesus, and taking a look at that. People are going to look at you a little oddly, as they did me when I said come from a Jewish background. I had to step aside intellectually and say, well, could Jesus be the Messiah? Where's the evidence? And it's all there. And interestingly, the rabbi, he says that there were rabbis who said that this was referring to Israel for a long time. Well, you know, Maimonides in the 15th, 16th century, a great Jewish scholar and teacher that is referred to by all Jews and looked upon with great respect, said that Isaiah 53 was not about Israel. And in the Talmud, there are some sections which had talked about Isaiah 53, prior to Jesus, being about the Messiah. In fact, it's in Targum Jonathan. It's also in the Sanhedrin, FOL.98, and the Zohar. All ancient writings that talked about prior to Jesus, that said this is about the Messiah, which is fantastic. So, you know, of course, the point that's made there, too, besides the contrast all the time, that Dr. Kaiser made, and Dr. Kaiser, of course, Dean of Trinity Seminary at that time, was stating that the deceitfulness, it says that this servant will have no deceit and will have done no violence, and so he doesn't deserve dying at all. And yet, in Isaiah, the 48th chapter, the first verse, it says that Israel speaks untruthfully and is deceitful. So obviously it can't be about Israel. In one place it's mentioned, my servant Israel. And obviously it means Jesus coming from Israel, because the servant that's mentioned here in Isaiah take the punishment. Any thoughts on that, Jay?
Well, what I find interesting, at the end of chapter 52, it says, so shall he sprinkle many nations. Again, leading up to this Isaiah 53 passage, which is very clear, points out Jesus, because he was the only one who had no deceit, no violence. He was unblemished. Now, and so by going back to that passage in Isaiah 52:15, he will be the covering of the sins of the Israelites.
Well, it's clear through the trespass offering. Now that's clear, and there's no disagreement among them about that. The word there is a trespass for, you know, with Moses and the sacrificial system that was set up by sacrifices throughout time that were done constantly throughout Israel for the people as an Asham, a trespass offering for the soul. And they had no disagreement about that. And it's a voluntary offering.
Right.
Which is very powerful.
Yeah, it's interesting. The rabbi brought in the New Testament, and I find that very interesting, because most rabbis only deal with Old Testament. So now that he's opened the door to the New Testament, then has he ever studied Romans chapter 11, that talks about the remnant of Israel will be given a spirit of stupor, eyes that they cannot see, ears that they cannot hear. Do you know why God gave them that spirit of stupor?
Not entirely. I think it's God's timing. You may have a better solution, or...
Well, you know, if we follow that passage into Revelation, and where then again he goes to the nation of Israel, And that remnant, that 144,000, again, the 12 tribes brought up all the way from Egypt, those 12 tribes of Israel, 12,000 of 12 tribes, that gives us our 144,000. He then, the book of Revelation talks about, he will then unveil them at that time and use them in the end as he used them in the beginning.
Well, they're not the same people. They're new, young
right, it's
people.
still, but it's still his remnant.
Right.
Out of the seed.
Right. Well, another point, too, is mentioned by the Apostle Paul. That point being that it's through the fact that this Jewish carpenter, my boss is a Jewish carpenter, you see that bumper sticker sometimes, that this Jew in this small place on the planet, that all of the earth would be talking about him in the end times. Could he be the Messiah? Is he really the only way? No, he's not the, but that he would be remembered, and his words would be remembered. And so Paul says that the fact that it goes out to all the non-Jews, the goyim, the heathen, the non-Jews, Gentiles, that would believe in him, their believing in him would make Israel start to think about it some more too.
I believe you used the word jealous. He would make them jealous.
The Apostle Paul did use that. And of course, the Apostle Paul was Jewish. Now, this is the interesting thing. This scholar, this Orthodox Jewish scholar, has written a book. You can look it up on the internet. I forget the name of it. I should have written it down this morning. I've read it. And you just look it up under Pinchas Lapide, which is this guy's name, Pinchus Lapide. Bill, that camera is there. Pinchas Lapide. And he believes, he's written a book where he believes that Jesus did resurrect from the dead, and Jesus is sent from God. But he's a Messiah only to the Gentiles. You come from a Gentile background, not Jewish.
I do.
Predominantly. I come from a Jewish background. And he believes that is written partially about Jesus, and that Jesus did resurrect from the dead. He has no doubt about that based on the eyewitnesses of the time as he studied it. And that's amazing for a Jewish scholar to come to that conclusion without him becoming a believer in Jesus and a follower of Jesus. So here he is saying, well, Jesus is the Messiah, but I don't think he's the Messiah for Israel. We'll know for sure when the Messiah shows up. If it's Jesus, we'll know it's him. If it's not, it'll be somebody else. But I know for sure he was sent by God to open the Ten Commandments and the law of the Bible to all of the world, which, of course, Jesus did.
Well, that's kind of contradictory in itself, isn't it, Mike?
In what way?
Well, that he would make that statement that Jesus resurrected from the dead, but yet not recognize him as the Messiah.
Well, as I said, as you said, God's kind of put a cloud over people's eyes. God says, you shall seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. That's in Jeremiah 29:13 and Deuteronomy 4:29. And Jesus says it, of course. And that's what he calls us all to do, to search for truth. And Jesus says, I am the way, the truth. And for this rabbi, he's close. I wouldn't be surprised. This was done a few years ago. I wouldn't be surprised if he's become a believer. In fact, I've got, if you're interested, I can put you on to the testimony of 12 rabbis who became believers, 12 or 13 or 14 rabbis that actually have become believers in Jesus over time.
Well, again, this program deals with evidence. And I'd like to remind our viewers that Isaiah wrote his book about 700 BC. And so, again, we have that evidence through the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, you can get on the internet and you can tap into Hebrew University over in Jerusalem. They have original copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, I want to remind you that that was found in 1947. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found a copied parchment around 300 BC, they dated, of Isaiah. And that's what we're teaching here tonight, is out of the book of Isaiah. And what's interesting in that find is word for word with the King James Bible. There was maybe 7 words that were different than the King James Bible, and they were words like house spelled H-O-U-S instead of H-O-U-S-E, but it changed absolutely nothing in the translation of the Bible. And so I just wanted to remind